What we've been studying for the past 4 weeks is something about how corporations might finance their assets. They might either do so with debt, they might do so with equity, right? So that's where we have been plotting about, and we've learned some theoretical constructs and so forth. Learned a little bit about how firms finance their assets. How do they decide what assets to have in the first place? How would they do that? And that's the so-called capital budgeting decision, right? Capital budgeting refers to the idea that you're going to make decisions about how to spend whatever money you've raised. That's the capital. So you have two major decisions that a firm must make. Financing decision, how to get some capital together in the liquid form of capital, money, right? And then after you've figured that out, what are you going to do with it? You have a capital budget. That refers to what you're going to purchase. What assets are you going to purchase with money you've raised? Well, now, in Chapter 8, we're going to study what is a very interesting topic and will serve you well in the future: capital budgeting, net present value, and other investment criteria on slide 8-1. Okay, so that's what we're going to do today. Here are our learning objectives on slide 8-. All right, so we're going to define something that's very critical and central to capital budgeting decision. It's called net present value. We're going to learn to use NPV to value long-lived investment projects of all flavors and kinds. I do want you to understand that this is a theoretical construct, and it's going to seem quite useful and full of application. It is, but it is theoretical, and I'll try to point out those elements as we go along. We're going to review some other investment criteria. The NPV is just the gold standard for capital budgeting decisions, but there are some others, and we're going to review those and compare them to net present value.
When you say gold standard?
Now, this just means that it is the right way to do it. The question was, what do you mean by gold standard? And what we mean by that is, since there are other ways to make capital budgeting decisions, the natural question arises, well, which one's the best? And the answer is net present value. All the others, to the extent they depart from net present value, depart in a way that is at least partly incorrect in theory. Okay? Those other criteria that we're going to look at, in particular, internal rate of return. Now, we've already had a brush with internal rate of return, have we not? When we studied the theory of bond valuation, we came up with the notion of what that was called internal rate of return. Bonds have 3 different rates. Yield to maturity, remember that about bonds? And pointed out that that is an internal rate of return for that instrument. Now we're going to see that capital projects of all kinds can be said to have an internal rate of return. We're going to learn how to calculate it. We're going to learn about its relationship to the net present value of the project, and see when it is the same and when it is not, those kinds of things. We're going to learn a little bit about the so-called payback criteria and find out that nobody in their right mind would ever even consider using payback in a serious capital budgeting decision framework, although it is still sometimes used by people who are lazy, mentally lazy. It must be mentally lazy to use it, because the truth is it's so easy to do the correct thing these days with computers and calculators. It's astonishing that anyone ever even refers to payback anymore. We're going to explore using what's called discounted cash flow analysis, DCF for short, for mutually exclusive investment projects. Mutually exclusive meaning that if you've got 2 possible projects, if you do A, you will not do B. One excludes the other. That would be like trying to choose between 2 copiers. Which one will you buy? Will you buy copier A, produced by Xerox, or will you buy copier B, produced by, I don't know who else produced copiers, HP? And buy one, you don't buy the other. So they're mutually exclusive capital projects, you see. Then we're going to consider the implications of capital rationing for capital budgeting decisions. We'll see what that means later. I don't even want to talk about it right now. When we're done, you'll be able to do all of these things that you see on the third slide, 1-3 there. Calculate the NPV of an investment, calculate the IRR for a project, understand how the two are related. They're definitely related to each other. And how we're going to understand that. We're going to know why the payback rule should be laughed at in all situations conceivable. We're going to use NPV, know how to use NPV to choose among mutually exclusive investment opportunities. And we're going to learn how to calculate something called a profitability index, which is really used only when capital is rationed. We'll come to understand what that means just shortly here. Okay, net present value. Let's just see what the definition of it is just to begin. Problem. Net present value is the discounted future cash flows of investment, some of those, of course, minus the cash outlay required today, which is usually just referred to as, quote, the investment. Now let me show you how this is theoretical. Let's suppose that you were a business, all right? You're a business firm. You're a corporation even. And you're thinking about building a new manufacturing facility in Waskego or somewhere, who knows where, right? Is there anything particularly of merit or important about, quote, the investment that you would make today as you begin that project? When in fact you realize that there's going to be cash flows outgoing to get that plant in place for probably 4 or 5 years? Is there something particularly important about the outlay that you might make in the very beginning? I would argue that that's an outdated concept entirely and utterly, because it's sort of like, okay, we're going to take a lump of money and we're going to make an investment, and then we're done with making the investment. That's not very realistic, is it? So that's really kind of a gross simplification of the matter, isn't it? And so we're going to see that in the end, the idea of net present value is a little bit restricted, and that the idea of discounted cash flow analysis is a much broader concept, and that ultimately that's what businesses use, but we still refer to it as the NPV criterion. Okay, so just by definition, it is the discounted future cash flows all added together of an investment minus the cash outlay required today. We'll see this in mathematical form here in a minute. Make it, these words sometimes are difficult to interpret until you see the symbols of the math. Net present value, what does it measure? It measures the increase in the value of shareholder wealth for a project that invests in real assets. Remember, you have real assets and you have financial assets. The NPV criterion for capital budgeting is referring to whether or not, if you do this project and you put some assets in place, will shareholder wealth be increased. Remember, what is the goal of the firm, the corporation? Maximize shareholder wealth. Remember, we started out several weeks ago considering whether that was a moral thing to do. I hope that Uncle Milton convinced you that indeed it's the only moral thing for a corporation to do. Focus on maximizing shareholder wealth, of course, within the letter law. Not an argument for breaking the law. Firms maximize shareholder wealth by accepting, now get this, only, but all projects that have positive net present value. In other words, if you come across a project, a capital project of any kind, and you find that it has even so much as 1 penny of positive net present value, you should do the project. Why? Because you will increase shareholder wealth by 1 penny. Now, it'd be better if you could find a project that would yield a net present value of $1 million, wouldn't it? Because then you'll increase shareholder wealth by $1 million. But does that mean you shouldn't do a project just because it only increases shareholder wealth by 1 penny? No, not if you can. If you can do it, if you have the capital to do it, you should do it because it will advance shareholder wealth. In fact, it says you should do only those projects that do have a positive NPV, but you should do all of the projects that you're aware of that do have a positive NPV. Interesting, huh? That's going to get us into the idea of capital rationing, because firms obviously do not have an infinite quantity of capital to deploy, do they? They have a finite amount of capital to deploy. So we're going to see that in some instances, in fact in many real-world instances, firms actually do have some form of capital rationing, and so they don't end up doing all of the projects that they might know about that have a positive NPV because they can't afford them. They cannot finance them. Okay? Well, we see that projects then with a zero net present value are break-even projects. They don't earn anything for the shareholders to add to their wealth, but they don't diminish shareholder wealth either. It's kind of like, who cares whether we do this project or not? Shareholders will certainly be disinterested in a project that has a NPV of zero. They might be interested in doing projects that have zero net present value. Labor unions, why? Well, because their laborers will get paid to work, and they like that, right? Who else might like companies to do projects that have zero net present value? Government, politicians, because it can make them look good. Doesn't add anything to shareholders' wealth. We'll see how this plays out as we get into this a bit more. Sure, shareholders pay taxes. What was the question? I didn't catch the question.
Projects are we?
Oh, projects that governments finance?
Yeah, that are.
Projects that governments finance might actually have negative net present value, for goodness sakes. Never mind zero net present value. And since governments are not corporations and are not pursuing a goal of maximizing shareholder wealth, even talking in those terms is a little bit mind-boggling. We know that, in fact, governments typically undertake projects that are financed just through taxes and debt, right? There is no concept of profit going on there at all. Governments undertake all manner of projects that businesses do not undertake. In fact, except in rare, what I take to be rare situations where we have the ideas of public goods, is a topic that we study in a course called Economics of the Public Sector. A guy like, well, it's called these days it's called Eco 3110. Used to just, but in any case, there are circumstances where projects government would undertake that a firm would not undertake make sense. For example, national defense, right? Will an individual firm undertake to defend the nation? Would you see a firm, a corporation, defending the nation? You would. Would you start a firm? Would you start a corporation to defend the nation? If you did, how would it be financed? What would you charge for your services, and how would you collect the bill? In any case, we're getting way off track here, so I'll pose those questions in economics of the public sector, perhaps. You've already taken that, haven't you, Tim? You have not?
Not yet.
Oh, okay. I've lost my mind. Well, I don't have much of it to lose, so it's easy to misplace. So, it is easy to lose one's mind. All right. So anyway, on with the next slide with 1-5. The internal rate of return, here is its definition. Now, this should be familiar to you because we've actually already studied it in the context of a bond and the idea of yield to maturity. The internal rate of return is that discount rate that would cause the NPV of an investment project to just equal zero. Well, all this is just a bunch of words. If this is making any sense to you at all, it's surprising to me because it wouldn't make much sense to me if this was the first time I were hearing this and I didn't know anything further about it. So these slides are by way of overview and summary, and some of what's on here won't make much sense until you begin to get your hands wet, will it? Dabble in the real stuff. But the IRR is the discount rate that causes the NPV of an investment project equal zero. Remember, in the case of bonds, the yield to maturity was the discount rate that caused the future cash flows associated with that bond to equal its current market price. Remember that? You could solve that polynomial equation and find that discount rate that caused the discounted cash flows all added up to just sum up to the market price of the bond. So that should give you an idea of what this IRR is. Firms will accept investment projects that have an internal rate of return greater than their opportunity cost of capital. The idea of the opportunity cost of capital for a firm is one that we will investigate and think about further down the road. How would you just think of it for right now, though, the opportunity cost of capital for a firm? How would you think of that? How might you think of that? How much money they can make by spending money. No, that's not a cost. Doesn't have any linkage to the idea of cost. We know that the words opportunity cost is an economic term, is it not? What is the notion of opportunity cost? In fact, I've taught you that if it isn't an opportunity cost, it's not a cost at all. What's the idea there? Well, it is the value foregone of choosing. If you take A instead of B, what do you forego? Well, you forego the value of B. That's the cost of having chosen A. That's the idea of opportunity cost. Now, here we encounter this term on slide 1-5, opportunity cost of capital. Well, what is capital? Just money. In the world of finance, it's just money. And so, in what sense does money have an opportunity cost? You could spend it on something else. And so if you are a firm getting ready to spend it on a capital asset, a building, plant, equipment, technology, etc., then where are you going to get that money from? You're going to finance it, right? So what's the easiest way for us to think of right now in terms of the opportunity cost of capital for a firm? The easiest way would be to imagine that the firm borrows everything, finances all of its assets through borrowing. In which case, what would be the opportunity cost of the capital that it's borrowing? The interest that it's paying. Remember? If a firm issues a bond, it must pay interest. We call it the coupon, do we not? So interest is the rental price of using someone else's money. So here, the easiest way for you to think of it right now, although it will be more complex a little later on, is that the opportunity cost of capital is just what the firm must pay to use someone else's money. Sure. The opportunity cost of capital is, however, another way to think about it, the rate of return that the firm has to earn on its assets in order to satisfy the shareholders, keep them from selling their shares. Now, we just came off a section where we were talking about the expected rate of return, the required rate of return. Guess what? That's just another name for those things. The opportunity cost of capital is the firm's required rate of return. If it does not earn its required rate of return, it won't have the capital for very long, will it? The shareholders will sell their shares. They will not be happy to hold those if the firm is not meeting their expectations. So we're beginning to weave a web of terminology here and finding out that several of those terms, expected rate of return, required rate of return, opportunity cost of capital, they're all linked together. In fact, they're really all referring to the same thing, in some sense at least. So if the internal rate of return for a firm project, so I'm getting ready to build this new plant, I run a calculation, I do some analysis, I come up with an internal rate of return. The internal rate of return turns out to be 7%, right? What if my opportunity cost of capital is 8%? Should I build that plant? Obviously not. Yeah, obviously that's going to have a deficit situation where I'm paying somebody to use their money 8%, and the project that I'm financing with it's only earning 7%. Duh! You begin to see then why the IRR criterion makes sense. Well, what if the IRR exactly equals the opportunity cost of capital? It's going to turn out that the net present value of that project is zero because it's just earning enough to pay my opportunity cost of capital, which means how much is it earning to shareholder wealth? Zero. It's not earning anything for the shareholders. So using the IRR criteria, it turns out we're going to find out that in many cases it's identically the same as using the NPV criteria, but sometimes it is not the same. And in particular, just because of the mathematics of the deal, of how IRR gets calculated, we'll see that when there are changes in sign of the cash flows that lie in the future, so that some of them are negative and some of them are positive, It could be that the internal rate of return will be a problem. And choosing between mutually exclusive projects, we'll find out that the IRR criteria is of no use whatsoever if we're trying to choose between two mutually exclusive projects. We'll read more about this when we read Chapter 8. The payback criteria says, well, let's take a look at this project and see if it pays itself back, its cost, its investment cost back within a specified time. So that'd be like saying, well, should I buy the new plant? Well, yes, because after 3 years of operation, the plant will have paid for itself, and everything after that's gravy. That's the payback rule. People do use the payback rule sometimes to make sort of rule of thumb assessments, but I'm going to convince you quite quickly here that it's utterly inappropriate and nonsensical. The payback rule takes account of the time value of money. It does take into account that time and money are related, but it does so utterly inappropriately. Okay, let's see if we can understand why. First of all, payback ignores cash flows that occur after some arbitrary threshold for payback has been reached. So if a firm, let's suppose that a firm did operate in the realm of stupidity and did say, all right, we'll undertake all those projects that have a payback of 5 years or less, right? Well, what it's doing is that if it has projects that last 10 years, it's ignoring all the cash flows that occur after the 5-year. And so you might ask, well, why 5 years? Where did that come from? And the answer is it's utterly arbitrary. Why not 5.7 years? Why not 3.1 years for the threshold? Well, the answer is there is no way to choose the threshold that makes any theoretical sense. So you immediately begin to see the problem with payback. It just doesn't make any sense. But when you hear advertisements for energy-saving appliances, or if you go shop for them at Lowe's or somewhere, you'll see that it'll give you a payback figure. It does, doesn't it? It'll say, well, this appliance, it pays back its costs in 3 years. Well, what should be the question that comes to mind? Yeah, I mean, just the whole idea of payback. Here's why it came into being in the first place. It's easy to calculate. It's very easy to calculate, and you've got to remember, you guys have no experience with this, but I will ask you to take account of it. We didn't used to have calculators. We didn't used to have computers. We were always looking for ways to make decisions that didn't require too much calculation, because calculating with pencil and paper is just hard work. It might even be impossible, right? Trying to do an internal rate of return using pencil and paper is ridiculous. It's impossible. Drive you back crazy. But now we've got these computers, so why anybody would ever use payback is completely unknown to me. Using a payback rule will typically not maximize shareholders' wealth. It just wouldn't. And so we know that that's what the firm is after. That's what a corporation is about.
So you're saying that
corporations back in the day that predates calculators and computers might have used payback rule. They might have said, we're only going to undertake projects that we can see our way clear to paying back our investment within 7 years or something. But it didn't make any sense for the reasons that we've just discussed. Why 7 years? Why not 5? See, there's no rationale to where to set the payback period whatsoever.
maybe they had enough money.
What you could do with payback is compare two projects, couldn't you? You could say which one appears to be better. Project A or Project B? Well, Project A pays itself back in 8 years. Project B in 5 years. Well, 5's better. You can see that, right? That makes some sense. No, you can't really, but I'm just saying it's not totally senseless. People wouldn't do something totally senseless, would they? Businesses don't usually. An individual person might, but businesses that do things totally senseless end up not being businesses very long. You see, they have to pass the market test. Kind of like being thrown into the swimming pool. Do you float? Can you swim? Or do you sink to the bottom? That's the market test, right? Governments don't have to pass the market test. That's part of the problem with governments, turns out. Anyway, enough of that. Companies might use a payback rule for quick and dirty initial calculations. Not anymore they don't. Why? Because strapped here to my side is a phone that has a computer in it. Why the hell would I use a payback rule? I can turn my palm on and I can go to the calculator, for goodness sakes. Why would I fart around with a payback rule? There's no circumstance imaginable where that would occur. All right.
So are we still responsible for
Yes, you're going to learn how it used to be calculated. For what reason?
Just
I have no idea why we even bother with it. Just so that you won't be ever sucked into being lazy enough to use it. Using net present value on slide 1-7 there, using NPV to choose among competing projects. Okay, competing projects are those that are mutually exclusive. If you do A, you won't do B. If you do B, you won't do A. That means A and B are mutually exclusive projects. 3 common causes. Okay, or cases rather. There are 3 common cases of mutually exclusive projects. Timing of an investment. Should we do it now or later? If we do it now, we're not going to do it later. Obviously, those are mutually exclusive, right? In different timing. Okay, choosing among mutually exclusive projects that have different time horizons. Okay, so we could have a project that lasts for 10 years. We have one that lasts for 5 years. Well, we can't directly compare a project that lasts 5 years to one that lasts 10 years because the one that lasts 10 years just automatically has more cash flows, doesn't it? That's not a level playing field, is it? So we need to make some kind of adjustment there. And then choosing when to replace aging equipment. Okay, so we've got this computer now. It still works. Replace it now, or should we replace it later? Yes, that's an ongoing issue for firms, and we're going to see that capital budgeting decision-making has ways to deal with that. Well, once it's broken, once it's no longer working, it's no longer a choice. If it's critical to your business operation, you have to replace it then. All right. We're going to use this idea called equivalent annual annuity, EAA. Sometimes it's on the cost side, sometimes it's on the revenue side. So if it was on the cost side, we could call it equivalent annual cost. But if it's on the revenue side, we wouldn't call it cost. And so it's better to just call it EAA, equivalent annual annuity. This is an approach that we use for each of these 3 common cases where net present value alone is not enough. It fails to work out for us. But we're going to see that EAA is based utterly and entirely on net present value, so it still meets the gold standard. The EA, come again? Hurt yourself. Ouch. Well, this could have been worse, right? You could have hurt something else. So the EAA allows projects to be compared on equal footing or level playing field using an idea of annualized cost or benefits. Okay, so we're going to annualize the NPV, how that works. We won't really understand it till we work some problems with it. But once you do, I think you'll see it. Then we come in slide 1-8 of our overview and summary of Chapter 8, Profitability Index. This is what we use when capital is rationed. That means we have a fixed capital budget. We cannot exceed it. All right, and so now, if we've got a fixed capital budget, remember that we said earlier, well, we want to undertake all those projects that have a positive net present value. What should you do if you've got a fixed capital budget and you cannot undertake all of the projects that appear to you have a positive net present value? They pick the ones that have the largest NPV. Turns out that will not work. Turns out that might not be the best idea. Well, we're abstracting from risk here, by the way. Tim just mentioned, well, what about risk? And so the larger NPV might have higher risk. I do want you to understand that in everything we're doing in Chapter 8, we're ignoring the possibility of risk. So we're treating our cash flows as if we knew them for certain. So that's a theoretical abstraction, is it not? Certainly it is, because it doesn't match up with the real world at all. So later on, we're going to find out how to take account of risk coming down the road. But right now, in Chapter 8, we're imagining that all of the cash flows associated with the projects that we're looking at are absolutely known with certainty. Well, the net NPV is always net. NPV just is net present value.
If you were to take the other hand, you think the project would be greater than the
Something like that, yes.
overcomplicated something, but
No, I'm saying you're on to the basic idea. If I had 4 different projects and I cannot fund all of them, there are different combinations of projects, are there not, that I might be able to fund?
So you choose the greatest.
I want a combination that's going to do what? Give me the greatest shareholder wealth for the investment outlay that I have to make, right, to get that project. So if I do project A, what if that took 90% of my capital budget, which would then made it impossible for me to do project C? But it might be that if I did C and B, that I get a better maximization of shareholder wealth than doing project A alone, do you see? Well, it turns out there's an easy way to go about this using what's called the profitability index. Here's what it is down at the bottom. It is just simply take the NPV and divide it by the initial investment. That gives you net present value per dollar invested, doesn't it? It's going to turn out that we can rank order. If we had 4 projects, we can rank order them by profitability index and see quickly which one to do first, which one to do second, etc., until the budget's exhausted. All right. Well, why do you have capital rationing anyway? Well, see, remember, where does capital come from? There are 2 sources of it, debt and equity, right? It could be that we have what is called soft capital rationing, which is just the firm limiting itself. It just says, well, we're going to choose not to spend any more on capital projects this year than this dollar amount. It's imposed by the firm itself, and you're going to read some of the reasons why a firm might do that. So in other words, soft capital rationing is a restriction that's imposed due to some limitation other than money. It's not that we don't have the money, it's that we're limiting ourselves for some other reason. What could be another resource that is limiting a firm's ability to undertake new capital projects? No, that's money. Other than money, other than the availability of money. How about the availability of talent to manage the projects? Maybe you ain't got any brains around to manage this money. So it's very often the case that a firm, look, do you suppose that Microsoft spends all of the capital that it has available to spend in any given year? Not a chance. And why? Because there are other resources that are limiting its ability to do so. Namely, the human element, the talent to manage it. You know, or maybe they can't find any projects that appear to them to have a positive NPV. It turns out, when you really understand finance and business, that's the hard part. The hard part is finding a project that has a positive NPV. Because you have to ask yourself, why would a project have a positive NPV in the first place? Well, we'll think about that more later. But it turns out that it's very difficult for firms to come up with a project that has a positive NPV that hasn't already been competed away. You have to have special knowledge to come up with a project that has a positive NPV. New inventions, new technology, new insights that others have not yet had. It is exactly positive NPV projects that give firms a competitive advantage. Which firms out there have the competitive advantages? Well, it's always shifting and changing. It's not static. It's very difficult to find projects that have positive NPVs, it turned out. The hard capital rationing just is the limitation of external funds available. There just aren't, there's no money. Can't borrow it, can't raise it by issuing stock. Just can't get any more money. That's called hard capital rationing. A lot of small firms face hard capital rationing, do they not? They can't come up with another dollar of capital by borrowing it or by issuing equity. Nobody will buy their equity and nobody will lend to them. With no capital rationing, firms undertake all the positive NPV projects they can identify. In the presence of either soft or hard capital rationing, we're going to find out that the firms will want to use the profitability index to rank order competing projects that are not mutually exclusive. If the projects are mutually exclusive, of course, then you don't need to rank order them. You just pick the best one. That's it. I have finished my overview of Chapter 8. I believe